Hi, I'm Professor Green, and we're going to start to talk a little bit about comparative advantage. This is the second part of chapter 6. So, comparative advantage has a handful of different economists that have contributed to this theory. The first one is Ricardo, that in 1817, he said, "What happens when one country has has an absolute advantage in the production of all goods?" And that he suggests that a country should specialize in production of goods that it produces most efficiently and then buy the goods that it produces less efficiently from other countries. As an engineer, that seems to make a lot of sense. How does this come together? Let's talk about that example with Ghana and Korea again. So here, this line here is saying that Ghana is more efficient with cocoa than it is with rice. And so without trade, then each country must consume what it produces. But with trade, then each country uses half of its resources to produce rice and then half of its resources to produce cocoa. So again, we're getting more efficient when we share and trade. So the gains that we make from trade, that we're saying that trade is a positive sum game in which all gain, as I said, right? The the boat, the tide rises and all boats win, something like this, right? So the potential world production then is greater from unrestricted free trade than with restricted trade, and it provides for a strong rationale for encouraging free trade, obviously. On the next slide, we see this in action. So we see that here initially the resources required to produce 1 ton of cocoa and rice. So from Ghana, they would produce they would need 10 resources to produce 1 ton of cocoa and 13.3 resources of rice, etc. But as we move through and we decide to then trade, we see that Ghana, they can then move their resources, the production with specialization, from 10 to 15, and 10 to 15 tons, so they can produce more because they're specializing in one particular area, becoming more efficient, which we'll talk about how that works in a minute. And then we talk a little bit about here South Korea as well. Now South Korea can move from 20 tons down to 10 tons of rice. And so at the same time, then we see that the total production moves from 12.5 to 15 for cocoa. And then the total production here for rice moves from 12.5 down to 13.75. So the total output now is higher, right? We have more products, more availability for people to eat. On the next slide, it's a continuation of this chart. And so we can then see that there can be an increase in consumption, and that consumption can increase in both countries then because of this specialization. But there are a handful of qualifications and assumptions, and we'll see as we talk through this chapter why Ricardo's model actually sometimes doesn't work in implementation. So in this example, we're only using 2 countries and 2 goods, right? So a very simple model. As things become more complicated, there are all these different variables that will potentially hurt the amount of things that can be, total amount of things of products that can be produced. We'll also account for zero transportation costs, right? So if the margins are slim, right, if there's just a small increase in consumption, maybe it doesn't make sense because it'll cost more than to ship the products. Similar price and values, we're also talking about that, and that there's no involvement of exchange rates here, and that is it's again a very basic model. We also look and see that resources can move freely from production of one good to another within a country. And so this is hard too, right? Because we're saying that very easily can people switch from making rice to making cocoa. And maybe they can, maybe that's a simpler model, but when we talk about making steel to making software or coding software, then it's very, very different. Right, and so let's go ahead and hop on to the next one, constant returns to scale. What we mean by constant returns to scale is diminishing returns, um, and increasing returns as well. But the idea is that you escalate. We'll talk about it in a couple slides, right? You escalate very quickly, but then not necessarily will you continue to escalate in your efficiency. The next one is fixed stocks of resources. So there's no change in resources. This is another variable. Maybe there's a storm, maybe there's not enough water for the land, etc. And then the last qualification and assumption for Ricardo's theory is that there's no effects on income distribution within the countries. And this one I find super interesting because it can be very relevant to today. So if the income distribution changes and people become more wealthier with this free trade, then potentially maybe the situation might change. People might not want to be farmers anymore, or they might not want to be radiologists anymore. So it's an interesting piece where development might affect how this theory can predict how efficiencies can show up. So, but despite all of these, the basic proposition works. There's a few extensions of this Ricardian model. We're gonna here suppose that the following assumptions are relaxed. Resources move freely from the production of one good to another within a country. There are constant returns to scale, and that diminishing returns does take over. And also that trade does not change a country's stock of resources or the efficiency with which those resources are utilized. So this is what we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides. First one here is comparative advantage again, but we're talking about these immobile resources. Resources do not always move freely from one economic activity to another. As we were saying, a steel worker cannot very quickly start developing code, as we saw in Pittsburgh. Also, governments may help retrain displaced workers. So that's an opportunity then for the government to get involved and start to train people, as we've been seeing here with the community colleges being heavily supported by the US government, making sure that people coming out of high school have a place to go to get a higher education very quickly, because no longer do we have those jobs where they can go to a factory and get a job as easily right out of high school. And these diminishing returns, as I've alluded to, this is a simple model assumes like constant returns to specialization. The units of resources required to produce a good are assumed to remain constant. So as I said, that we will continue to be more and more efficient, but that's not necessarily always the case. The assumption of diminishing returns is more realistic, since not all resources are the same quality and different goods use resources in different proportions. And so as we move forward, that the quality might change or get worse, and then we won't also be as efficient in our production. The next slide has a graph that speaks to that. So this is an example of Ghana under the production possibility frontier for diminishing returns, saying that after a certain time, actually, that they're not going to be as efficient when it comes to making their products. And so that's why there are a lot of critiques or critics saying that the Ricardian model is actually a little bit too simple. So let's talk about some more theories. Here, before we jump on to the free trade theory, just one last slide, that trade might increase the benefits of increased international trade, or that it increased the country's stock of resources as supplies become available from abroad. The example that the textbook gives that I relate to quite closely is that in the 1990s, the Americans had a great opportunity to sell their products in Eastern Europe. So now that the wall came down and the Eastern Europe was open to growth, that was a huge market for the Americans. I saw it for me personally because I was in consulting at the time, and my mother is from Prague, so I was going to the Czech Republic very often in the 90s, and all of a sudden we saw big offices for Deloitte, McKinsey, Accenture, etc., and a really nice opportunity for American businesses to invest abroad. The next one here is that free trade might increase the efficiency of resource utilization and free up resources for other uses. So that's really nice that now things become more efficient, and then you don't need as many workers or as many resources. Then you can use those things for other things. And the last one is that dynamic gains will cause a country's PPF to shift outward, and that's what what the next slide shows when we speak to also like new technologies that show up, because you're so like a company might potentially be so focused in the production of a particular good, and they might invent a new technology to help them become even more efficient. So that's what this shows, that the PPF can even grow out, and this can stimulate then further growth. So now we'll talk about the Samuelson critique. So he talks about trade, jobs, and wages. They're dynamic gains that can lead to less beneficial outcomes. And he's saying that, right, not everything about the Ricardo model works perfectly, and not everything about free trade is great. Technology advances allow companies to offshore service jobs that were not traditionally internationally mobile, right? As we saw before, that we see that that's why a lot of these jobs move offshore, lowers the market clearing wage rate enough to outweigh positive benefits. This is where we're saying that that even though cheaper products are available in Walmart, we can't necessarily make up for that in the lost wages that we have. That we're shipping things abroad for production, which is great. We're getting cheaper products, but we're also moving jobs abroad as well. And here the last one is that concedes that free trade has historically benefited rich countries, and that
Mommy, I have to go potty.
And so the last slide here speaks to the evidence for the link between trade and growth. And so, but I did want to say on this previous slide that this question here that speaks to concedes that free trade was historically benefited rich countries, and that protectionist measures may be harmful. This speaks to the idea that developing countries can't upgrade the skills of their workforce fast enough, and that they will run into the issue of diminishing returns. Fortunately or unfortunately, Asia has defeated this, and Asia has been saying that they've been able to keep up, and that they develop now and educate a lot of engineers, and so that has not been a problem in Asia. And so the last slide for part 2 here is the evidence between the link between trade and growth. This says that countries are open to trade, have higher growth rates than countries that close economies to trade, and that the higher growth rates raise the income levels and the living standards. And I think this is a main key point of this course, is that international trade in the big picture is a good thing, and that the statistics show that between 1970 and 1990 in developing countries, that open economies, they grew by 4.49%, and that closed economies were only growing by 0.69%. So I think that's a really important statistic to show that in the big picture, we do see growth in international trade when it comes to economies. All right, I'll end part 2 here, and then we'll start again in a minute with part 3.